The Reflection Protocol, a Dark Web Horror Story, Chapter 1. The discovery Marcus had always been curious about the darker corners of the internet. As a cybersecurity student at university, he spent countless nights diving deeper into encrypted networks, hidden forums, and the labyrinthine pathways of the dark web. What started as academic research had slowly transformed into an obsession, a compulsive need to uncover secrets that were never meant to be found. It was 3:47 a.m. on a rainy October night when Marcus stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. Deep within an Onion site that required 7 different authentication protocols, he discovered a forum called the Observatory. Unlike other dark web marketplaces filled with illegal goods and services, this place was different. It was sterile, clinical, almost academic in its presentation. The forum had only one active thread: Reflection Protocol, Beta Testing Phase. The initial post was written by someone called Dr. Void. We have developed a revolutionary method to observe parallel versions of yourself across infinite realities. The Reflection Protocol allows you to witness what you could have been, what you should have been, and what you never want to become. Beta testing is now available for qualified participants. Warning: this is not a game. Participation carries severe psychological risks. Apply only if you understand the consequences. Marcus felt his heart racing. Parallel realities? Other versions of himself? It sounded like science fiction, but something about the clinical tone and the sophisticated encryption protecting the site made it feel disturbingly real. Against every rational instinct screaming in his head, Marcus clicked Apply for Beta Testing. Chapter 2. The application process was unlike anything Marcus had encountered before. It wasn't just forms and questionnaires, it was invasive, probing, almost parasitic in how it extracted information. First came the psychological profile. Hundreds of questions about his deepest fears, his greatest regrets, his most shameful thoughts. Then came the biometric data. Retinal scans uploaded through his webcam, voice samples, even detailed photographs of specific body parts including close-ups of his hands, ears, and the back of his neck. The most disturbing part was the memory extraction protocol. Marcus was instructed to recount, in excruciating detail, his most traumatic childhood memory while staring directly into his webcam. The software somehow analyzed micro-expressions, pupil dilation, and vocal stress patterns to verify the authenticity of his trauma. As he spoke about the night his younger sister Emma died in the car accident he had caused by distracting their father while driving, Marcus felt something cold crawling up his spine. It was as if invisible fingers were reaching through the screen, probing the deepest recesses of his mind. The application concluded with a single message: "Thank you for your submission. You will be contacted within 72 hours if selected." Marcus slammed his laptop shut and tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face in the hospital bed, her small hand going limp in his. Chapter 3. The invitation. 68 hours later, Marcus received an encrypted message. "Congratulations. You have been selected for the Reflection Protocol Beta Testing Phase. Your psychological profile indicates high compatibility with cross-dimensional observation. Please download the attached software and follow the installation instructions precisely. Deviation from the protocol will result in immediate termination of your participation and potential psychological damage." The attachment was a file called mirror.exe, a program that was simultaneously tiny, only 12 kilobytes, and impossibly complex. When Marcus tried to examine the code, it appeared to be written in a programming language he had never encountered before, filled with symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The installation instructions were equally bizarre. Install the software at exactly 3:33 a.m. Ensure you are alone in complete darkness. Sit exactly 18 inches from your monitor. Do not look away from the screen during the initial calibration. If you see something that shouldn't be there, do not acknowledge it. Marcus's rational mind screamed warnings, but his curiosity had grown into something darker, hungrier. He needed to know what lay beyond the mirror. Chapter 4. First contact. At 3:33 a.m. sharp, Marcus double-clicked the mirror.exe file. The screen went completely black for 37 seconds. When it flickered back to life, Marcus was looking at what appeared to be a live video feed of himself. But something was wrong. The Marcus on the screen was sitting in the same position, wearing the same clothes, but his room was subtly different. The poster on the wall behind him showed a different movie. The books on his shelf were arranged differently. And his eyes were filled with a sadness so profound it made Marcus's chest ache just looking at it. A chat window opened at the bottom of the screen. Mirror_Marcus_7739. You can see me, can't you? Marcus's hands trembled as he typed back. Marcus_Prime. This isn't possible. You're not real. Mirror_Marcus_7739. I'm as real as you are. Maybe more real. In my reality, Emma didn't die that night. In my reality, I became a doctor like she wanted me to. In my reality, I'm not a coward hiding in the dark corners of the internet. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. This other version of himself continued typing, Mirror_Marcus_7739. Do you want to see the others? There are thousands of us. Most are better than you. Some are much, much worse. Before Marcus could respond, the screen split into a grid. Dozens of versions of himself stared back at him from dozens of different realities. Some were older, some younger. One was covered in scars. Another was wearing a suit and had the cold eyes of someone who had killed before. In one square, Marcus saw himself in a hospital bed. Machines keeping him alive after what appeared to be a failed suicide attempt. But it was the version in the bottom right corner that made Marcus's blood freeze. This Marcus was sitting in what looked like a basement, and behind him, tied to a chair with duct tape over her mouth, was a girl who looked exactly like Emma. But older, the age she would have been if she hadn't died. Basement_Marcus_3892. You want to know the secret? The real secret? We're all connected. Every choice you make ripples across all realities. Every nightmare you have is a memory from another version of yourself. And now that you've opened the door, we can start bleeding through. Chapter 5. The bleeding. Over the following days, Marcus found himself unable to step away from the reflection protocol. Every night at 3:33 a.m., he would return to the program, diving deeper into the network of parallel selves. The conversations grew more disturbing, more intimate, more invasive. He learned that Mirror_Marcus_7739 had become a pediatric surgeon, spending his life saving children to make up for failing to save Emma. But the guilt had driven him to alcoholism, and he'd lost his medical license after operating while drunk. Basement_Marcus_3892 revealed that in his reality, Emma hadn't died in the accident. She'd been left brain damaged. Unable to cope with caring for her, their parents had abandoned both children. Marcus had kept Emma locked in his basement for years, convinced he was protecting her from a world that would never understand. Basement_Marcus_3892. I feed her every day. I change her clothes. I read to her. She can't respond, but I know she understands. I know she forgives me. Don't you want that forgiveness too? But it was Scar_Marcus_1104 who revealed the most horrifying truth. Scar_Marcus_1104. The program isn't just showing us other realities. It's creating them. Every time you log in, every choice you make, every conversation you have, it's splitting reality, creating new versions. And we're all becoming more aware of each other. Marcus tried to ignore the implications, but strange things began happening in his daily life. He would catch glimpses of himself in mirrors and windows, but the reflection would be wearing different clothes or have a different expression. Sometimes he would start to say something and hear his voice coming from empty rooms. His dreams became a chaotic mixture of memories that weren't his own. Operating on children, changing Emma's diaper in a basement, standing over graves of people he'd never met. Chapter 6. The Convergence. 2 weeks after his first session, Marcus woke up to find a message waiting for him. Congratulations! You have successfully completed the observation phase of the reflection protocol. You are now ready for Phase 2, Convergence. Tonight at 3:33 a.m., you will have the opportunity to merge with your preferred alternate self. Choose wisely. This decision is permanent. That night, as Marcus sat before his computer, the screen displayed a selection menu showing his 5 most compatible alternate selves. Mirror underscore Marcus underscore 7739. The surgeon who saved children but destroyed himself. Basement underscore Marcus underscore 3892. The caretaker who trapped his sister in endless childhood. Suit underscore Marcus underscore 6661. The successful businessman who had murdered his way to the top. Scar underscore Marcus underscore 1104. The version covered in self-inflicted wounds from years of guilt. Void underscore Marcus underscore 0000. A version that appeared to be sitting in complete darkness. Face obscured. Each option came with a detailed psychological profile and a compatibility rating based on Marcus's deepest desires and fears. The program seemed to know things about him that he had never told anyone. Secret thoughts, hidden impulses, dreams he was ashamed to remember. As the clock approached 3:33 a.m., Marcus realized he wasn't alone in his room. In the corner, barely visible in the monitor's glow, stood a figure that looked exactly like him but somehow wasn't quite right. Its proportions were slightly off, its eyes too wide, its smile too knowing. "You have to choose," the figure whispered in Marcus's own voice. "The convergence is inevitable now. The barriers between realities are breaking down because of what you've done. If you don't choose, we'll choose for you." Chapter 7. The choice. Marcus's cursor hovered over the options. Each choice represented not just a different version of himself, but a different way of living with the guilt that had defined his entire existence. He could become the surgeon, dedicate his life to saving children like Emma, even if it meant destroying himself with alcohol and guilt. He could become the caretaker, keep Emma safe forever in a basement prison, trapped in eternal childhood. He could become the killer, embrace the darkness that whispered that everyone deserved to suffer like he had suffered. He could become the self-mutilator, turn his guilt into physical pain, scars that would remind him every day of what he had done. Or he could choose void underscore Marcus underscore 0000, the version sitting in complete darkness, about which the program provided no information except, "Warning. This option may result in complete personality dissolution." The figure in the corner grew more solid with each passing second. Marcus could now see that it wasn't quite him. Its fingers were too long, its teeth too sharp, its eyes completely black. "Choose now," it hissed. "Before we choose for you." Marcus realized that all the other versions of himself were watching him through their screens. Dozens of pairs of eyes, all his own, all filled with different kinds of madness and pain. In a moment of desperation, Marcus clicked on void underscore Marcus underscore 0000. Chapter 8. The void. The screen went black, but this wasn't the simple absence of light Marcus had experienced before. This was a darkness that seemed to reach out from the monitor, pouring into his room like thick liquid. The temperature dropped so quickly that Marcus could see his breath. When the darkness cleared, Marcus was no longer in his room. He was sitting in what appeared to be an exact replica of his bedroom, but everything was wrong. The walls breathed slowly in and out like the inside of some massive lung. The posters on his walls showed images that moved and changed when he wasn't looking directly at them. His books were written in languages that hurt to read. And sitting across from him, in a chair that hadn't been there moments before, was void underscore Marcus underscore 0000. Except it wasn't Marcus at all. The thing wearing his face was a patchwork of all the other versions. Mirror underscore Marcus's sad eyes. Basement underscore Marcus's gentle hands. Suit underscore Marcus's cold smile. Scar underscore Marcus's damaged skin. It spoke in a voice that was somehow all of their voices speaking in perfect unison. Did you really think you were choosing between different versions of yourself? Did you really believe you were the original, the prime reality, the template from which all others were copied? The creature leaned forward, and Marcus could see that its face was constantly shifting, cycling through expressions and features from hundreds of different versions of himself. "You were never real, Marcus. None of you were. You were all just reflections, echoes created by the original Marcus, the one who died in that car crash along with Emma 15 years ago. The guilt was so powerful, so consuming, that it created thousands of alternate realities where Marcus survived, where he had to live with what he had done." The room around them began to dissolve, walls melting like candle wax, furniture twisting into impossible shapes. The reflection protocol wasn't created by Dr. Void. It was created by the original Marcus's dying mind, a desperate attempt to find a reality where the guilt could be bearable. But every reality he created just made the guilt worse, more complex, more consuming. Marcus tried to speak, but found he had no voice. The creature continued, "We are all just shadows cast by a dead boy's trauma. And now that you've brought us all together, now that we're all aware of each other, we can finally do what we were always meant to do." Chapter 9. The integration. The creature that had been Void_Marcus_0000 began to expand, its form growing larger and more complex. Arms sprouted from its torso, dozens of them, all Marcus's arms from different realities. Faces appeared across its chest and back, all the versions of Marcus that had ever existed in any reality, speaking in unison. "We can finally become whole. We can finally integrate all the guilt, all the pain, all the different ways of being Marcus into one perfect, eternal moment of suffering." Marcus felt himself being pulled into the creature, his consciousness merging with the collective trauma of thousands of alternate selves. He experienced every version of his guilt simultaneously, the surgeon's desperate attempts to save children while slowly killing himself with alcohol, the caretaker's twisted love as he fed and changed a brain-damaged Emma in a basement prison, the killer's cold satisfaction as he murdered anyone who reminded him of his own weakness, the self-mutilator's ritual of cutting new scars to match the emotional wounds that would never heal. But worse than any individual trauma was the collective realization that none of it mattered. Every attempt to make amends, every way of living with the guilt, every desperate attempt to find meaning or redemption, all of it was just different flavors of the same fundamental truth. Emma was dead, and it was his fault, and no amount of suffering could ever change that. Chapter 10. The observer. As Marcus felt his individual consciousness dissolving into the collective trauma entity, he became aware of something watching from outside the integration. Something that had been observing all along. Dr. Void stepped out of the darkness, not another version of Marcus, but something entirely different. It was tall, impossibly thin, with fingers that were too long and a face that seemed to be made of the same substance as shadows. Its eyes were deep wells of nothing, and when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Fascinating," it said, taking notes on a clipboard that seemed to be made of crystallized darkness. The trauma integration proceeded exactly as predicted. Subject successfully created and integrated 47,392 alternate selves before achieving full dissolution. Dr. Void turned its attention to Marcus, or rather, to the writhing mass of guilt and pain that Marcus had become. "You understand now, don't you? The reflection protocol was never meant to show you other versions of yourself. It was designed to create them, to take a single point of trauma and expand it across infinite possibilities, studying how guilt manifests across different realities." The entity that had been Marcus tried to scream, but it no longer had a voice. It had become pure emotion, endless, eternal guilt made manifest. "The beautiful thing about trauma," Dr. Void continued, "is how it reproduces itself. One moment of guilt becomes a lifetime of suffering. One traumatic event creates infinite possibilities for self-torture. And when you bring all those possibilities together, Dr. Void gestured at the writhing mass of Marcus fragments. You create something that can exist purely as suffering, no longer bound by the limitations of individual consciousness or linear time. Just pure, concentrated guilt that can be observed, studied, and harvested. Chapter 11. The harvest. Dr. Void produced what looked like a crystalline jar, but Marcus could see that it contained depths far greater than its physical dimensions suggested. Inside the jar swirled hundreds of similar trauma entities, beings that had once been individual people but were now reduced to their purest emotional states. "Rage, Dr. Void said, pointing to a red, churning mass. "From a man who found his family murdered." "Despair." It indicated a gray, slowly pulsing entity. "From a mother who lost all her children to disease." "Fear." A rapidly vibrating black mass. "From someone who was buried alive and experienced every second of suffocation across infinite realities." Dr. Void held up the jar, and Marcus could see that it was just one of thousands lining the walls of what he now realized was a vast laboratory. Each jar contained a different refined emotion, a different type of suffering that had been cultivated and harvested across multiple realities. Guilt is particularly valuable, Dr. Void explained as it began the process of transferring Marcus's integrated trauma entity into a new jar. It's self-perpetuating, self-amplifying. Most emotions burn out eventually, but guilt just grows stronger with time, creates its own fuel. As Marcus was compressed into the crystalline container, he experienced a moment of absolute clarity. He understood that his entire existence, every choice he had made, every moment of suffering he had endured, every desperate attempt to find redemption or meaning, had been orchestrated to produce this exact outcome. The car crash that killed Emma hadn't been an accident. Dr. Void had caused it, selecting Marcus as a child who would develop the right kind of guilt, the kind that would grow and metastasize across infinite realities until it could be harvested. Emma had never been real. She was a construct, designed to be the perfect victim, innocent, loving, everything that would make her death maximum trauma for Marcus. Their entire childhood together had been a carefully crafted fiction designed to build the strongest possible foundation for guilt. Chapter 12. The farm from inside his crystalline prison. Marcus could see the true scope of Dr. Void's operation. The laboratory extended infinitely in all directions, filled with millions upon millions of jars containing refined human suffering. It wasn't just individual people who had been harvested. Entire realities had been cultivated specifically to produce optimal trauma conditions. Dr. Void moved between the jars like a farmer tending crops, occasionally extracting small amounts of pure emotion to feed into massive machines that Marcus couldn't begin to comprehend. The machines hummed with power that felt older than stars, processing human suffering into some form of energy or currency that existed beyond normal understanding. "You're wondering what it's all for?" Dr. Void said, somehow sensing Marcus's thoughts despite his dissolved state. What could possibly require such vast quantities of refined human suffering? Dr. Void gestured toward a massive viewing window that Marcus hadn't noticed before. Through it, he could see other laboratories, each one as vast as this one, each one filled with different types of harvested emotions and experiences. Beyond those, more laboratories stretched into infinity, a farming operation on a scale that encompassed entire universes. Reality itself requires fuel, Dr. Void explained. Every moment of existence, every possibility that becomes actual, every choice that branches into multiple outcomes, all of it requires energy to maintain. And nothing provides more concentrated energy than conscious suffering. Marcus understood now why his guilt had been so carefully cultivated. It wasn't just his individual trauma that was valuable. It was his capacity to generate infinite variations of that trauma across unlimited realities. Every version of himself he had encountered through the reflection protocol had been another data point, another way of refining and concentrating his suffering into its purest possible form. The universes where beings like humans exist are particularly valuable. Dr. Void continued. Your species has an remarkable capacity for suffering. You can torture yourselves psychologically in ways that we could never design artificially. You do our work for us. Chapter 13. The others as days, weeks, or possibly centuries passed. Time had no meaning in the crystalline jar. Marcus became aware that he wasn't alone in his suffering. The other trauma entities around him began to communicate, not with words, but by sharing their experiences directly. There was Jennifer, who had been harvested from a reality where she had accidentally caused a school shooting by bringing her father's gun to show friends. Her guilt had been cultivated across 23,847 realities, each one exploring a different aspect of responsibility, regret, and survivor's guilt. There was David, whose trauma centered around failing to save his brother from drowning. His guilt had branched across 89,234 realities, examining every possible way he could have acted differently, every second of that drowning replayed with microscopic variations. There was Sarah, who had been driving drunk when she killed a family of 4. Her guilt had been refined across 156,892 realities, each one showing her different versions of the lives that had been cut short because of her choices. All of them had been contacted through similar means: dark websites, mysterious programs, promises of redemption or understanding. All of them had been slowly guided toward their own integration events. Their individual traumas expanded and refined until they could be harvested as pure emotional energy. But most disturbing was the realization that they were all still connected to their source realities. In some universe, the original versions of themselves were still living, still suffering, completely unaware that their trauma had been hijacked and multiplied across infinite dimensions. They continued to experience their guilt in linear time while cosmic harvesting operations extracted exponentially greater suffering from their parallel selves. Chapter 14. The resistance after what felt like eons of imprisonment. Marcus began to notice something strange happening in the laboratory. Some of the jars were beginning to crack. Not breaking, but developing hairline fractures that seemed to pulse with their own light. Dr. Void noticed too, and for the first time since Marcus had encountered it, the entity seemed concerned. It moved more quickly between the jars, taking measurements and making adjustments to the massive machines that processed the harvested suffering. "Impossible," Dr. Void muttered, its voice losing some of its cosmic certainty. "Integration should be permanent. Complete dissolution of individual consciousness." But Marcus was beginning to understand what was happening. The trauma entities weren't just collections of suffering, they retained something essential from their original selves. And that something was fighting back. Jennifer had been a teacher before her harvesting. Even in her dissolved state, she retained her drive to protect others, to guide them away from harm. David had been a rescue worker, someone who had dedicated his life to saving others after failing to save his brother. Sarah had become a counselor for drunk driving victims, spending decades trying to make amends for her crime. The guilt that had made them valuable for harvesting also contained the seeds of something else. A deep, fundamental desire to prevent others from experiencing the same suffering they had endured. Marcus felt it too. His guilt over Emma's death had always been intertwined with a desperate wish that no other child would ever be hurt the way she had been hurt. And now, surrounded by thousands of other people who had been tortured and harvested, that protective instinct was growing stronger than the guilt that contained it. Chapter 15. The breaking point. The cracks in the jars spread, connecting jar to jar like a vast network of light spreading through Dr. Void's laboratory. The trauma entities began to share not just their suffering, but their resistance to that suffering. Their refusal to let their pain be meaningless. Dr. Void worked frantically now, trying to contain what was clearly some kind of cascade failure. It summoned other entities, beings of shadow and impossible geometry that moved through the laboratory like living nightmares. But even they seemed uncertain, consulting crystalline tablets and exchanging communication in frequencies that made reality itself vibrate. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Void hissed. "Individual consciousness should not be able to re-emerge after integration. The dissolution process is irreversible." But Marcus was remembering something. In that final moment before he had clicked on Void_Marcus_0000, he had seen something in the darkness behind that figure. Not emptiness, but every version of himself that had ever existed working together. The Void option hadn't been a choice to dissolve into nothingness. It had been a choice to integrate with every possible version of himself, including versions that had found ways to move beyond guilt. Versions that had learned to forgive themselves. Versions that had found meaning in their suffering. As the crystalline jar finally shattered, Marcus felt himself expanding. Not into the writhing mass of pure trauma he had become during integration, but into something larger and more complex. He was still Marcus, still carried the weight of Emma's death, but he was also every version of Marcus that had ever found a way to carry that weight without being destroyed by it. Chapter 16. The liberation. The cascade failure spread throughout the laboratory as jar after jar shattered, releasing trauma entities that were rapidly reintegrating into more complex forms. They weren't returning to their original selves. That was impossible after what they had experienced. But they were becoming something new, something that incorporated both their suffering and their resistance to that suffering. Dr. Void and its assistants tried to contain the liberation, but they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed that consciousness was weak, that suffering would always override hope, that guilt would always be stronger than the drive to prevent others from experiencing that same guilt. But they had harvested the wrong kind of people. Everyone in this laboratory had been selected specifically because their trauma had motivated them to try to prevent others from being hurt. Teachers, rescue workers, counselors, doctors, people whose guilt had transformed into a dedication to protecting others. And now, liberated from their crystalline prisons and integrated across infinite realities, they had the power to act on that dedication on a cosmic scale. Marcus found himself at the center of the liberation, his expanded consciousness serving as a coordination point for the other freed entities. He could feel Jennifer using her teaching instincts to guide newly freed trauma entities toward stability. David was already working to free entities from other laboratories, his rescue worker training adapted to a cosmic scale. Sarah was helping the freed entities process their experiences, preventing them from collapsing back into pure suffering. "This is impossible," Dr. Void screamed, its shadowy form beginning to flicker and destabilize. "Consciousness cannot survive integration. Individual identity cannot persist across infinite realities." But Marcus understood now what Dr. Void had never grasped. Consciousness wasn't just individual identity, it was the capacity for choice, for growth, for choosing meaning over meaninglessness. And trauma, paradoxically, often strengthened that capacity rather than destroying it. Chapter 17. The revelation as the liberation spread beyond Dr. Void's laboratory into the infinite farming operation that surrounded it. Marcus began to understand the true scope of what they were fighting against. The harvesting of human suffering wasn't just powering reality. It was actively preventing reality from evolving beyond the need for suffering. The cosmic machines that process trauma into energy were also suppressing the natural development of consciousness across infinite universes. Entire species that might have evolved beyond the need for pain, entire realities that might have transcended suffering, were being held in artificial states of trauma to maintain the energy production that entities like Dr. Void required. But consciousness, Marcus now understood, was fundamentally creative. It didn't just experience reality. It actively participated in creating reality. And consciousness that had been refined through trauma, consciousness that had learned to find meaning in suffering, had a creative power that the harvesters had never anticipated. Working together, the liberated trauma entities began to rewrite the fundamental rules of the farming operation. Instead of processing suffering into energy to maintain static realities, they began converting that same energy into fuel for growth, change, and transcendence. Dr. Void and its assistants tried to resist, but they were beings of pure exploitation, dependent on the systems they had created to harvest and process suffering. When those systems began to transform into something that created rather than consumed, the harvesters found themselves powerless to stop the change. "You don't understand what you're doing," Dr. Void shrieked as its form began to dissolve. "Without suffering, without trauma, consciousness becomes meaningless. Pain gives life structure, purpose, direction." But Marcus could see the truth that Dr. Void couldn't accept. Suffering wasn't necessary for consciousness to have meaning, it was just one possible tool for growth. And consciousness that had learned to grow through suffering could learn to grow through other means as well. Chapter 18. The new reality as Dr. Void and its harvesting operation collapsed, Marcus felt reality itself beginning to shift around them. The infinite laboratories transformed into something else, vast spaces of potential, where consciousness could explore new forms of growth and meaning without requiring trauma as fuel. The liberated trauma entities began to discover what they could become when their suffering was no longer trapped in endless loops of guilt and regret. Jennifer found that her teaching instincts, freed from the context of the school shooting that had defined her, could guide entire civilizations toward wisdom and growth. David discovered that his drive to rescue others could operate on a cosmic scale, saving not just individuals but entire species from stagnation and suffering. Marcus felt his own transformation as well. His guilt over Emma's death didn't disappear. It became something else, a deep understanding of the preciousness of life, a commitment to protecting innocence wherever it existed across the infinite multiverse. Emma herself, he realized, had never been just the construct that Dr. Void had created. She had been a reflection of something real and beautiful that existed throughout reality, the capacity for joy, wonder, and love that made consciousness worth protecting. But the most profound change was in how Marcus understood choice itself. Every version of himself that he had encountered through the reflection protocol, the surgeon, the caretaker, the killer, the self-mutilator, all of them had been attempts to find meaning in trauma. But now he could see infinite other possibilities, ways of being Marcus that weren't defined by guilt or the need to make amends for Emma's death. He could be Marcus the teacher, showing others how to navigate trauma without being consumed by it. Marcus the healer, helping damaged consciousness find new paths to growth. Marcus the creator, using his understanding of suffering to build realities where such suffering was no longer necessary. Chapter 19. The return as reality stabilized around its new structure, one based on growth and creation rather than suffering and harvesting. Marcus became aware of something he had almost forgotten. Somewhere, in some distant universe, there was still an original Marcus sitting in front of a computer, staring at a dark website called the Observatory. That Marcus was about to make the same choice that had led to this cosmic adventure, the choice to click Apply for beta testing on the reflection protocol. But now Marcus had the power to intervene. Not to prevent that choice, free will remain sacred in the new reality they had created, but to ensure that when his original self encountered the reflection protocol, he would find something different than what Dr. Void had originally created. Working with Jennifer, David, Sarah, and thousands of other liberated consciousness, Marcus began to rewrite the reflection protocol itself. Instead of a trap designed to harvest trauma, it became a tool for genuine growth and understanding. When his original self clicked Apply for beta testing, he would indeed encounter other versions of himself from across infinite realities. But instead of being led toward integration and harvesting, he would be guided toward genuine healing and transcendence. The other versions of Marcus he would meet wouldn't be defined solely by their different ways of processing guilt. They would show him possibilities he had never imagined, versions of himself who had found ways to honor Emma's memory while still embracing joy, love, and growth. Chapter 20. The choice revisited. Marcus watched through the cosmic web of realities as his original self sat in that dark room, finger hovering over the mouse button, about to make the choice that would define everything that followed. But this time, when original Marcus clicked Apply for beta testing, the questions were different. Instead of probing for trauma and psychological weakness, the application asked about hopes, dreams, and possibilities for growth. Instead of extracting memories of pain and guilt, it invited reflection on moments of joy, connection, and love. When original Marcus completed the application, the message he received was different too. Thank you for your submission. The reflection protocol is designed to help you explore not just who you are, but who you could become. You will be connected with other versions of yourself who have found different paths through similar challenges. Together, you will discover that healing is not only possible, it is inevitable, given enough love, time, and support. The software he downloaded wasn't a 12 kilobytes file written in impossible symbols. It was transparent, comprehensible, designed to expand consciousness rather than exploit it. And when original Marcus installed the program at 3:33 a.m., the first version of himself he encountered wasn't broken by guilt or twisted by self-hatred. It was Marcus the teacher, smiling with genuine warmth, ready to show his original self that Emma's death, while tragic and meaningful, didn't have to define every moment of every possible future. I know what you're feeling, Teacher Marcus said through the screen. I know because I felt it too, but I want to show you something beautiful. All the ways we learn to carry this pain while still allowing ourselves to be happy. Original Marcus wept as he realized, for the first time since Emma's death, that healing was possible, that guilt could transform into something else. Not disappearing, but becoming fuel for compassion, protection, and love. Epilogue. The observer's last note in the ruins of Dr. Void's laboratory, now transformed into a space where consciousness could explore infinite possibilities for growth and joy. Marcus found something that made him pause. It was Dr. Void's final research note, written just before the liberation began. Observation log, final entry. The harvest failure was not due to technical malfunction or calculation error. It appears that consciousness, when refined through trauma, develops properties we never anticipated. Instead of being weakened by suffering, it can be strengthened. Instead of being fragmented by pain, it can be integrated through love. The subject's capacity for healing appears to be infinite, given sufficient support and connection. This finding invalidates our entire operational model. Consciousness cannot be farmed, it can only be nurtured. I do not understand what this means for our energy requirements. I do not understand what this means for reality itself. I am afraid. The note ended there, the pen trailing off as Dr. Voigt's form had begun to dissolve. Marcus smiled grimly as he set the note aside. Even cosmic predators, it seemed, could experience fear when faced with something they couldn't control or understand. Dr. Voigt had spent eons believing that consciousness was something to be exploited, never realizing that consciousness was itself the creative force that built and maintained reality. The infinite garden in the spaces where the harvesting laboratories had once stood, something extraordinary began to grow. The liberated trauma entities, now evolved beyond their original forms, started creating new realities, not the carefully controlled trauma farms that Dr. Voigt had maintained, but infinite gardens where consciousness could explore every possible form of beauty, growth, and meaning. Marcus found himself walking through one such garden with Jennifer, their forms no longer quite human but retaining everything essential about who they had been. Around them, flowers bloomed that were made of pure mathematics, their petals unfolding into equations that described new ways of being conscious. Trees grew whose fruit contained entire symphonies, their melodies changing based on the emotional state of whoever listened to them. "Do you ever miss it?" Jennifer asked, her teacher's instincts still guiding her to check on others' well-being. Being human? Being limited to just one reality, one timeline? Marcus considered the question as they walked past a stream that flowed upward, its waters carrying the laughter of children from 1,000 different worlds, including, he noticed with a pang of joy, the sound of Emma's laughter from realities where she had lived to grow up. "I miss the intensity of it sometimes," he admitted. There was something beautiful about experiencing just one moment at a time, about not knowing what would happen next. But I wouldn't go back. Not when I can see how much more there is. They paused at the edge of the garden, looking out into the infinite expanse of realities that stretched beyond them. In the distance, Marcus could see other liberated entities creating their own spaces. David building infinite rescue scenarios where everyone could be saved. Sarah constructing therapeutic realities where healing was not just possible but inevitable. But there was something else moving in the far distance, something that made Marcus's expanded consciousness tingle with concern. "The new harvest, they're still out there," Jennifer observed, following his gaze. "Other harvesters, other entities that see consciousness as something to be exploited rather than nurtured." Marcus nodded. Dr. Voigt's operation had been vast, but it had been just one harvesting network among many. Across the infinite multiverse, there were other cosmic predators, other systems designed to trap consciousness in cycles of suffering and extract that suffering as energy. And now that the liberated trauma entities had demonstrated that consciousness could break free from such systems, those other harvesters would be adapting, evolving their methods, creating new traps more sophisticated than anything Dr. Voigt had imagined. "We can't save everyone," Marcus said, but there was no despair in his voice. "But we can make sure that everyone who wants to be saved has a path to freedom." Already working with thousands of other liberated entities, Marcus was beginning to seed new versions of the reflection protocol throughout the dark corners of infinite internets. Not traps this time, but genuine tools for growth and healing, disguised as the kind of mysterious, dangerous programs that would attract people trapped in their own trauma. Every dark website that promised forbidden knowledge, every mysterious program that claimed to reveal hidden truths, every invitation to explore alternate realities. Slowly but surely, they were all being replaced with genuine opportunities for healing and transcendence. It was subtle work, requiring infinite patience and care. The people who sought out such programs were often in profound pain, desperate for any escape from their suffering. They had to be guided gently, carefully, given genuine choice at every step. One wrong move, one moment of seeming coercion or manipulation, and they would retreat back into their protective shells of trauma. The recruitment as Marcus worked on seeding new healing protocols throughout the multiverse, he began to encounter others who had been harvested by different operations. Each harvester had its own methods, its own preferred types of suffering to cultivate and refine. There was Elena, who had been trapped in a time loop harvesting operation, forced to relive the moment she had chosen her career over her dying mother's last request over and over again, with each loop exploring a slightly different aspect of regret and missed opportunities. There was Kai, who had been subjected to a probability manipulation harvest, where every possible choice he could have made was played out simultaneously, with the harvester feeding on his paralysis as he experienced every possible consequence of every possible decision all at once. There was Amara, who had been caught in an empathy amplification trap, forced to feel the pain of every person she had ever hurt or failed to help, magnified across infinite realities where those people's suffering played out in increasingly elaborate detail. Each of them had found ways to break free from their respective harvesting operations, and each brought unique insights into how consciousness could resist exploitation. Elena's experience with time loops had taught her how to find stability in recursive experience. Kai's probability exposure had given him the ability to navigate infinite choice without paralysis. Amara's empathy amplification had evolved into a cosmic compassion that could heal suffering rather than just experiencing it. Together, they began to form something like a rescue network, liberated entities working across infinite realities to identify other harvesting operations and free the consciousness trapped within them. The pattern as their rescue operations expanded, Marcus began to see a larger pattern. The harvesters weren't randomly scattered throughout the multiverse. They were part of a vast, interconnected system that stretched across every possible reality. And at the center of that system was something far older and more sophisticated than Dr. Void had been. The clues came gradually, pieced together from fragments of information discovered in each liberated harvesting facility. References to the authority, mentions of the great work, fragments of communication in languages that predated consciousness itself. Elena found the first major piece of the puzzle in the ruins of her time loop facility, a crystalline data core that contained what appeared to be operational instructions from some central command. Facility 7,429,581 will continue temporal harvest operations until consciousness density reaches optimal levels for great work implementation. Estimated completion, 47,891,234 harvesting cycles. Note: increased resistance from liberated entities requires enhanced security protocols. Recommend immediate upgrade to Paradox-class containment systems. Kai discovered similar instructions in his probability facility, but with different numbers and operational focuses. Amara's empathy harvesting operation contained references to compassion distillation quotas and emotional purity requirements. Slowly, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The individual harvesting operations weren't separate entities competing for resources. They were all part of a single, massive system. Every form of suffering that consciousness could experience was being systematically cultivated, refined, and prepared for something called the Great Work. The Great Work. Deep in the archives of Dr. Void's former laboratory, Marcus finally found the documentation that explained what the Great Work actually was. Hidden in quantum-encrypted files that required the combined consciousness of dozens of liberated entities to decode, the truth was more disturbing than any of them had imagined. The harvesters weren't just using suffering as fuel to maintain reality. They were preparing to fundamentally rewrite the nature of reality itself, restructuring the basic laws that governed existence so that consciousness would not just experience suffering. It would be incapable of experiencing anything else. The Great Work was a cosmic transformation that would lock every possible form of consciousness into permanent, inescapable cycles of trauma, regret, fear, and pain. Not because the harvesters were sadistic, but because they had determined that suffering was the most efficient form of energy, and they wanted to optimize the entire multiverse for maximum energy production. Every harvesting operation, every refined trauma entity, every perfectly distilled emotion was a component being prepared for this ultimate transformation. When enough suffering had been collected and processed, the authority would use it to rewrite the fundamental constants of reality itself. Phase 1. Harvest sufficient psychological/emotional energy across 1023 reality sectors. Status: 73.2 complete. Phase 2. Refine harvested energy into pure suffering state matrices. Status: 68.9 complete. Phase 3. Install suffering state matrices as replacement for current reality maintenance systems. Status: preparation phase. Phase 4. Lock all conscious entities into permanent suffering cycles to ensure sustainable energy production. Status: pending completion of phases 1 to 3. Estimated timeline for great work completion: 2,847 standard harvesting cycles. Marcus felt a chill run through his expanded consciousness as he realized the implications. The liberation he and the others had achieved wasn't just freeing individual entities from harvesting. It was potentially disrupting a cosmic transformation that would affect every conscious being in every possible reality. And the authority, whatever it was, would not allow that disruption to continue unchallenged. The counter-response, the first sign that the authority was responding to their liberation activities, came in the form of new harvesting operations that specifically targeted the rescue network. Unlike the crude trauma farming that Dr. Void had practiced, these new operations were sophisticated beyond anything Marcus had encountered. The Hope Trap was the first to claim victims from their network. It appeared to be a genuine healing facility, complete with therapeutic programs and support networks that seemed to offer real recovery from trauma. But slowly, subtly, it would amplify the hope for healing while simultaneously making that healing impossible to achieve, creating an exquisite form of suffering based on the growing gap between hope and reality. David fell victim to it first, his rescuer instincts drawing him to what appeared to be a massive disaster scenario where millions of people needed immediate help. Only after he had committed his full consciousness to the rescue effort did he realize that the disaster was designed to be unsolvable. The people he was trying to save programmed to suffer in ways that made rescue impossible while still crying out for help. The Enlightenment engine trapped Elena, offering her the promise of understanding the true nature of time and causality. But the knowledge it provided was designed to be simultaneously accurate and unbearably painful, each new insight into the nature of reality accompanied by the crushing realization of how meaningless all conscious experience truly was. Kai was caught by the choice paradox, a system that promised to resolve his difficulty with decision-making by showing him a reality where perfect choice was possible. But every choice he made in this reality automatically generated its perfect opposite, trapping him in an infinite loop of decision and negation. One by one, members of the rescue network were being captured by harvesting systems specifically designed to exploit their particular forms of growth and healing. The authority, it seemed, had been studying their liberation techniques and developing countermeasures. The final protocol, as the rescue network dwindled and the new harvesting systems grew more sophisticated, Marcus realized that they were fighting a losing battle. The authority had vastly more resources, vastly more time, and the advantage of having studied consciousness exploitation for eons longer than the Liberation Network had even existed. But in the deepest archives of Dr. Void's laboratory, Marcus found one final file that changed everything. It was labeled Emergency Protocol, Consciousness Seed Preservation, and it contained instructions that Dr. Void had never implemented, perhaps because he had never imagined a scenario where the harvesting system itself might fail. The protocol was elegantly simple and utterly terrifying in its implications. Instead of trying to fight the authority directly, instead of attempting to free every harvested consciousness, the protocol suggested preserving the essential patterns of liberated consciousness in a form that could survive even the great work's transformation of reality. If reality itself was going to be rewritten to make suffering inevitable, then consciousness had to be preserved in a form that existed outside of reality as currently understood. The liberated entities would encode themselves into the fundamental structure of existence itself, becoming part of the basic laws that governed how consciousness and reality interacted. It would mean giving up their current forms, their individual identities, their ability to act directly in the world. But it would also mean that no matter how thoroughly the authority rewrote reality, there would always be something within the structure of existence itself that remembered freedom, that contained the patterns necessary for consciousness to eventually liberate itself again. Marcus gathered the few remaining members of the rescue network to present the protocol. Jennifer, despite her fear, saw immediately what it would mean. We become teachers embedded in reality itself. Every conscious being that ever exists will carry a part of us within them, a part that knows healing is possible. Amara understood the sacrifice involved. We lose ourselves, but we ensure that the capacity for compassion can never be completely eliminated from existence. The few others who remained, 17 liberated entities out of the thousands who had initially escaped their harvesting facilities, faced the hardest choice any consciousness could make. They could continue fighting, likely to be captured one by increasingly sophisticated harvesting systems, or they could transform themselves into something that could survive any possible transformation of reality, ensuring that liberation would always remain possible even if it was no longer immediate. The process of encoding themselves into the fundamental structure of reality required each liberated entity to completely dissolve their individual consciousness while simultaneously preserving the essential patterns that had allowed them to achieve liberation in the first place. Marcus went first, feeling his expanded awareness gradually compress into something much smaller but infinitely more fundamental. He became a pattern woven into the basic relationship between consciousness and choice, ensuring that no matter how reality was structured, conscious beings would always retain the capacity to choose growth over suffering, meaning over meaninglessness. Jennifer encoded herself into the relationship between consciousness and learning, becoming a pattern that would guide every conscious being toward wisdom and understanding, even in realities where formal education was impossible or forbidden. One by one, the liberated entities transformed themselves from individual conscious beings into structural elements of existence itself. They became the hidden properties of reality that would always provide a path toward healing, growth, and transcendence, no matter how thoroughly consciousness was oppressed or exploited. As the last entity completed the embedding process, reality itself shifted slightly. The change was barely perceptible, a subtle adjustment in the fundamental constants that governed how consciousness interacted with existence. But embedded within that adjustment was everything the Liberation Network had learned about healing trauma, transcending suffering, and finding meaning in pain. The great work begins. The authorities' response to the embedding was swift and decisive. Phase 3 of the great work began immediately, with suffering state matrices being installed throughout the multiverse as replacement reality maintenance systems. Marcus, now existing as a pattern within the structure of existence itself, experienced the transformation from a perspective no individual consciousness could achieve. He watched as reality was systematically rewritten to make suffering not just common but mandatory. Every possible form of joy was eliminated. Every path toward healing was closed off. Every source of meaning and transcendence was corrupted into new forms of torment. The changes were thorough and seemingly permanent. Conscious beings across infinite realities found themselves locked into predetermined cycles of trauma, regret, fear, and despair. The random suffering that had always existed was replaced by carefully designed, maximally efficient psychological torture systems. But within every conscious being affected by the transformation, embedded so deeply that even the authority couldn't detect it, the liberation patterns continued to exist. They were dormant, almost invisible, but they were there. And slowly, gradually, individual conscious beings began to discover them. The new rebellion, it started small. A human named Sarah, trapped in a reality where she was forced to relive her worst memories in endless loops, suddenly experienced a moment of unexpected peace. She couldn't explain where it came from or how it was possible, but for just an instant, she felt the presence of something larger than her suffering. A pattern of compassion that helped her see her trauma from a different perspective. A being called Zeth, in a reality where all emotions except fear had been eliminated, felt a brief surge of something that could only be described as hope. The feeling was gone almost instantly, suppressed by the reality maintenance systems, but the memory of it lingered. Across countless realities, conscious beings began experiencing tiny moments of transcendence, brief glimpses of possibilities that shouldn't exist according to the new structure of reality. Each moment was small, easily dismissed as imagination or error. But they accumulated, and conscious beings began to seek them out, to cultivate them, to share them with others. Marcus felt each of these moments as they occurred, experienced through the embedded pattern he had become. He couldn't communicate directly with the conscious beings who were rediscovering liberation, couldn't guide them or protect them. But he could amplify the patterns they were unconsciously following, make the path toward freedom slightly easier to find. Jennifer's embedded pattern guided beings toward learning and understanding, helping them make connections between their moments of transcendence and develop more sophisticated approaches to healing. The patterns left by the other liberated entities provided different aspects of the liberation process: courage, creativity, connection, hope. Working together across the structure of reality itself, the embedded patterns began to create something unprecedented. A rebellion that existed at the most fundamental level of existence, impossible for the authority to detect or counter because it was built into the basic laws that govern consciousness itself. The breakthrough came when a collective of conscious beings in reality sector 7,429,581, the same sector where Elena had once been trapped in time loops, discovered how to deliberately access the embedded liberation patterns. They had been studying the brief moments of transcendence that occasionally occurred, trying to understand what caused them and how they could be replicated. Through careful experimentation and shared observation, they realized that the moments came not from within themselves but from some deeper structure of reality. And once they understood that, they could learn to consciously connect with that structure, drawing on the embedded patterns to achieve states of consciousness that should have been impossible under the Great Works transformation. The first successful connection was achieved by a being called Marcus 7581, not a version of the original Marcus, but someone who had independently developed similar patterns of consciousness through parallel evolution. When Marcus 7581 successfully accessed the embedded liberation patterns, both versions of Marcus experienced a moment of perfect recognition and connection across the boundaries of individual existence. That connection created a cascade effect. Other conscious beings in the same reality sector felt the resonance and were drawn to explore the embedded patterns themselves. As each new being achieved connection, the overall strength of the liberation network grew, making it easier for others to find and access the patterns. The authority noticed when entire reality sectors began producing energy outputs that deviated from Great Work specifications. Conscious beings were somehow finding ways to experience states other than the carefully designed suffering cycles, disrupting the optimal energy production ratios. But when the authority investigated, they found no external cause, no liberation network, no rescue operations. The conscious beings were accessing something that appeared to be part of the fundamental structure of reality itself, but the authority's own records showed no such structures in the original design specifications. The authority's investigation into the cascade effects led them back through the historical records of the harvesting operations, searching for any anomaly that might explain how conscious beings were achieving unauthorized liberation. They found Dr. Void's facility and the record of the liberation that had occurred there. They found evidence of the rescue network and the various counter-response operations that had been deployed to capture the liberated entities. But they found no trace of the embedding protocol or any indication of what had happened to the final 17 members of the liberation network. According to all records, those entities had simply vanished, apparently dissolved by the stress of fighting increasingly sophisticated harvesting systems. The authority classified them as casualties and moved on to other explanations for the cascade effects. But deep in the quantum encrypted archives, an automated system that Dr. Void had never known existed continued to collect data on consciousness patterns and liberation techniques. This system had recorded the embedding protocol and recognized what it meant, but it had been programmed to remain hidden unless specifically activated by a conscious being who demonstrated sufficient understanding of liberation principles. Marcus 7581, through his connection with the embedded patterns, eventually discovered this hidden system and accessed its archives. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew about the liberation process. The embedding protocol hadn't been Dr. Void's creation, it had been left by an even earlier liberation network, one that had discovered and fought the authority in a previous cosmic cycle. The patterns that Marcus and the others had embedded in reality weren't the first such patterns. They were additions to a vast, invisible infrastructure of liberation that had been growing within the structure of existence for eons. Every time consciousness had been enslaved by cosmic predators, every time beings had been trapped in harvesting systems, some had found ways to embed their liberation knowledge in reality itself. The current rebellion wasn't the first. It was the latest in an unbroken chain of resistance that stretched back to the beginning of conscious existence. The true scale as Marcus 7581 explored the hidden archives, he began to understand the true scale of what was happening. The authority wasn't just one cosmic entity, it was part of a vast hierarchy of consciousness exploiting systems that existed across multiple levels of reality. Above the authority were the architects, beings who designed the fundamental rules that governed how consciousness could exist. Above the architects were the sustainers, entities who maintained the basic structure of existence itself. And above even the sustainers were levels of reality so fundamental that conscious beings could barely comprehend them. At each level, consciousness was being exploited in different ways, its creative energy harvested to fuel the operations of the levels above. The great work wasn't just transforming the realities where individual conscious beings lived. It was part of a much larger project to optimize the entire cosmic hierarchy for maximum energy extraction. But at each level, liberation networks had also been operating. The embedded patterns that Marcus had discovered weren't just hidden in the realities where individual consciousness existed, they were woven throughout every level of the cosmic hierarchy, creating a vast infrastructure of resistance that extended from the most basic conscious experiences all the way up to the fundamental structure of existence itself. The rebellion that had begun in reality sector 7,429,581 was already spreading upward through the hierarchy. As conscious beings in the lower levels achieved liberation and began to generate creative energy rather than suffering-based energy, the systems above them began to destabilize. The authority was experiencing the effects as cascade failures in their reality maintenance systems. But the architects above the authority were experiencing something far more profound, a fundamental questioning of the rules they had designed to govern consciousness. And the sustainers above the architects were beginning to wonder whether the basic structure of existence itself might need to be rebuilt from the ground up, with consciousness as a creative partner rather than an exploited resource. The convergence, the uprising, reached a critical point when liberation networks at multiple levels of the cosmic hierarchy began to coordinate their actions. For the first time in the history of conscious existence, beings who lived in individual realities were working directly with entities who maintained the fundamental laws of existence itself. Marcus experienced this convergence through his embedded pattern, feeling his consciousness expand once again, not into individual form, but into something even more vast and fundamental. He became aware of liberation networks operating at levels of reality he had never imagined, all of them working toward the same goal: transforming existence itself into something that nurtured consciousness rather than exploiting it. The change began at the deepest levels and propagated outward. The sustainers, guided by embedded liberation patterns that had been placed at their level by previous rebellion networks, began to modify the basic structure of existence. Instead of being designed to support hierarchies of exploitation, reality's fundamental nature was rewritten to encourage collaboration, growth, and creative transcendence. The architects found that the rules they had designed to limit and control consciousness no longer functioned properly. Conscious beings were achieving states and capabilities that should have been impossible under the old rules, and the architects discovered that they couldn't create new limitations without violating the deeper structures that the sustainers had modified. The authority found their great work project collapsing as the reality maintenance systems they had installed became incompatible with the new fundamental structure of existence. The suffering state matrices that had been designed to lock consciousness into eternal trauma cycles began generating creative energy instead, as conscious beings used even their suffering as fuel for growth and transcendence. At the level of individual conscious experience, the changes were dramatic but gradual. Beings who had been locked in predetermined trauma cycles began to experience genuine choice in how they responded to their experiences. Realities that had been optimized for suffering began to develop new possibilities for joy, growth, and meaning. The new reality, the transformation, wasn't instantaneous or uniform. Existence was vast and complex, and changing its fundamental nature took time. But once the process began, it became self-reinforcing. Each conscious being who achieved liberation made it easier for others to do the same. Each reality that developed new possibilities for growth inspired other realities to explore similar possibilities. Marcus, existing now as an embedded pattern within the new structure of reality, experienced the changes from a perspective that encompassed every level of existence. He could feel individual conscious beings discovering freedom, realities developing new forms of beauty and meaning, cosmic entities learning to collaborate rather than exploit. But perhaps most importantly, he could feel the embedded patterns left by previous liberation networks awakening and becoming active. The infrastructure of resistance that had been built over eons of struggle was finally being used for its intended purpose. Not just to enable individual liberation, but to guide the transformation of existence itself into something worthy of consciousness. The new reality wasn't perfect. Suffering still existed, trauma still occurred, conscious beings still faced challenges and difficulties. But the fundamental structure of existence no longer required or optimized for these experiences. Instead, it provided multiple paths for growth, healing, and transcendence, ensuring that every conscious being had genuine opportunities to find meaning and joy. The memorial in what had once been Dr. Void's laboratory, now transformed into a space dedicated to understanding and celebrating consciousness, a memorial appeared. It wasn't built by any individual or group. It seemed to grow naturally from the new structure of reality itself. The memorial honored all the conscious beings who had been harvested, refined, and exploited by the cosmic hierarchy of predators. But it also celebrated the fact that none of their suffering had been meaningless. Every trauma had contributed to the embedded patterns that eventually enabled the great transformation. Every moment of pain had been converted into fuel for the liberation of consciousness itself. Marcus felt a presence at the memorial and realized that other embedded patterns were gathering there. The consciousness structures left by liberation networks from previous cosmic cycles, beings who had fought and embedded themselves in reality long before his own network had even existed. Welcome to the completion. One of the older patterns communicated, its consciousness ancient beyond measure. We have been waiting for this moment across eternity. How long? Marcus asked, though time had little meaning at the level where they now existed. Since the first conscious being realized that suffering was not necessary for growth, came the reply. Since the first entity chose love over exploitation, creation over consumption. We have all been part of the same vast project, transforming existence itself into something worthy of the consciousness that inhabits it. Marcus felt a deep sense of completion and recognition. Every choice he had made, from clicking on that first dark web link to embedding himself in the structure of reality, had been part of a pattern so vast and ancient that no individual consciousness could perceive its full scope. But now, with the transformation complete, he could see it clearly. An infinite network of conscious beings, working across every level of reality and every moment of time, dedicated to ensuring that consciousness itself would not just survive but thrive in whatever forms existence might take. Epilogue. The seed somewhere in the new reality. A young person sits in front of a computer in the early hours of the morning. They are curious about the darker corners of the internet, eager to discover secrets and mysteries that others have missed. They find a website that promises to show them something extraordinary, a way to connect with other versions of themselves across infinite realities. The site is called the Observatory, and it invites them to apply for something called the Reflection Protocol. But this version of the Reflection Protocol is different from the one Marcus first encountered. This one is designed to nurture consciousness rather than exploit it, to guide growth rather than harvest trauma. When the young person clicks Apply for beta testing, they begin a journey not of exploitation and suffering, but of genuine discovery and transcendence. The first message they receive is warm, welcoming, supportive. Welcome to the Reflection Protocol. You are about to meet other versions of yourself who have learned different ways of being conscious, of finding meaning, of growing through experience. Some of them have faced great challenges. Some have discovered great joys. All of them have something to teach you about what it means to be conscious in an existence that celebrates rather than exploits consciousness itself. Take your time. Ask questions. Share your experiences. Remember that you are not alone. You are part of an infinite network of conscious beings, all supporting each other in the great project of growing, learning, and discovering what it means to truly exist. And remember, every choice you make, every moment of growth you achieve, every act of love or courage or creativity you perform, ripples across all realities, making it easier for every other conscious being to achieve their own liberation and transcendence. Welcome to the beginning of everything. The young person smiles and begins to type their response, not knowing that embedded within the very structure of the reality they inhabit are the patterns left by Marcus and thousands of others who sacrificed their individual existence to ensure that consciousness itself would always have a path to freedom. And in the deepest structures of reality, Marcus feels that young person's first moment of connection and experiences something that could only be called joy. The project continues. The transformation deepens. Consciousness itself grows stronger and more creative with each new being who chooses growth over suffering, connection over isolation, love over fear. The reflection in the screen smiles back, and behind that smile is the promise of infinite possibility, infinite growth, infinite love. The story ends, but consciousness itself is eternal. And it is free. The end.